Well, there's several different things we can talk about. We'll start here with a picture of what's called the Aristarchus Plateau. Now, the evolutionary model, as you mentioned, says that the moon is over 4 billion years old. It's not a very large object either. Therefore, it should have cooled down over those billions of years, and it should not be geologically active anymore. This photograph, though, shows us just one of the many areas on the moon that have exhibited apparent geological activity. Now, it's interesting because this goes back to the 1500s, really, since people had really been observing the moon in depth.
With Galileo.
And there have been many reported cases of people seeing strange things occurring on the moon. Now, we're used to seeing the moon look something like this. These observers have noted occasional smudges or glows of light or pinkish hues that appear and disappear on the surface of the moon.
Amazing.
Now, it's interesting because these are all temporary. They come and they go, and as
they have seen what? Tell us again.
Smudges appear as you're looking on the surface, and then they disappear, or a glow, or a flash, or a pinkish color that appears and disappears.
Can you solve the mystery?
Well, for a long time, scientists didn't want to accept this as being true, because the basic idea here is that the moon would have to be geologically active to produce these events. The idea would be that the moon would be venting out gas from inside, which would stir up clouds of dust.
Yes.
You would have electrostatic discharge inside the cloud, so that would produce the flashes. And just the flashes.
In physics, it's all logical if you can produce that discharge from within.
Right. But the moon is supposed to be billions of years old, is not supposed to be geologically active anymore, therefore is not supposed to be doing any of this. But finally, in the late 60s, NASA issued a report acknowledging that apparently there is something going on here. It issued the Chronological Catalog of Reported Lunar Events, and that's a long name for a report, but it listed over 579 different entries of various things like this going on the moon. In fact, a few years later, the Apollo 15 mission actually measured radon gas coming from this area of the moon.
Interesting.
So the moon is supposed to be old, cold, and dead after all these billions of years, but it doesn't look that way, judging by the activity that we see.
And take us from there.
Okay, here we have a picture of the moon that I've had here because you notice the large dark areas are very emphasized in this photo. These are called maria, and these are believed to be impact basins on the moon. The belief is that something large hit the moon at some time in its past and cracked the moon's crust, forcing lava to ooze up and fill in these basins here.
Yes.
Now, that's a reasonable explanation so far, and in fact, here's a close-up of one of the maria. You can see how smooth the maria area is.
That's interesting.
Whereas if we had a close-up of the highland area here, you would see it's mountainous and rocky.
Yes.
So apparently something hit the moon, caused these large impact basins, forcing the lava to ooze up and fill them in. But here's a question. How long would it have taken between the impact that cracked the moon and the lava oozing out? Now, we would say days, maybe a week or two, perhaps as long as a month. The evolutionist says 500 million years. 500 million years? Here's why. In the maria, we see something called ghost craters, and here's a close-up, as I mentioned. You notice here, there's what appears to be a crater, but it's been filled in by lava.
Certainly.
Here's another one up here that's a little less obvious, and if you look closely at some of these other little things that are peeking up here and there from within, apparently these craters and the other features were on the floor of these basins when the lava came and filled everything in and filled in the craters.
That's logical.
That's logical. However, the moon has a lot of ghost craters. Now, the evolutionist, believing in billions of years, has come up with a rate of cratering to match that model. That rate of cratering is very slow, except for a period early in the moon's history. But during the time this was going on, the cratering was supposed to be slow. Therefore, since there's so many craters, there must have been 500 million years in between the impacts and the lava filling in. So the logical implication of evolution is that it took 500 million years between the impacts that formed the basins and the lava coming out to fill the basins in.
We call that a non sequitur. It does not match. It does not follow.
Common
so
sense.
what are the real facts?
Well, the real facts would say that obviously the cratering rates are much higher than evolution assumes, but that has further implications for the age of the moon and other planets as well, because this cratering rate is applied across the solar system.
Yes.
So merely from looking at some things poking up from the floor of these basins, we can say that the cratering rate that evolutionists assume is apparently wrong. That has implications for how old the moon and other objects in our solar system are.
And we can say that this fill-in mechanism occurred very rapidly, so therefore, what are your calculations and what would you determine this to be?
Well, the Bible doesn't really give us enough information to know exactly when and how the cratering took place. Some creationists would associate this with the flood and the catastrophes that went on then. Others would say that this might be more primordial from when God was originally forming the earth and the moon in the beginning. The Bible doesn't really tell us either way, but what we do know is that it didn't take 500 million years for the impact to have lava ooze out.
And it's all recent and fits within the framework of a few thousand years.
Yes.
Now, we have actually visited the moon, as you stated earlier. Mankind has walked on the moon. I will never forget, in 1969, I sat up. I lived in Florida at that time, and I watched from a distance the launch of the Apollo spacecraft. I was so glued to radio and television, and I heard those early statements, one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind.
Yes.
Well, you take it from there, please.
Okay. As you know, there were several Apollo missions. 3 of them left behind some experimental equipment that is actually still being used today.
Okay.
This is the only Apollo experiment that is still going on. What you see here is called an LLR, which stands for Lunar Laser Ranging Gear or reflector, depending on how you want to put it. They left multiple versions of these at different spots on the moon. Now, from Earth, this is basically a reflective surface, and it's designed so that scientists on the Earth can fire a laser at the moon, and if they manage to hit one of these, which is of course very difficult because it's a very small target, but they are able to do this. When we fire a laser from Earth, the laser will bounce off and return to Earth, and that has allowed scientists to measure how far the moon is from the Earth over time. It's very important because the moon, as it turns out, is receding from the Earth at a little less than 4 centimeters per year currently. Now that's only an inch and a half, which isn't much. But the way this works, the moon would have been receding faster in the past. Now, the reason it's receding has to do with the tides that the moon raises on the Earth, and we probably don't need to discuss details. The important thing is that we know it's happening. We understood why it was happening even before we measured it, because this was predicted. Now, work this backwards. It would have been receding faster each year you work back, and it turns out the moon would have been touching the Earth only 1.5 billion years ago.
Wow, and it's supposed to be 4.6 billion years, and the Earth is supposed to be 4.6 billion years in age. So, again, this is a non sequitur. It doesn't match. It doesn't follow.
Not at all.
And so, again, we're driven to recency rather than the standard cosmological evolutionary explanation. And the moon serves marvelous purposes graphically. What do we have here?
Well, I have this as an example of design. The Bible says that the moon was formed as one of the 2 great lights, as you mentioned, and it has specific purposes. It's to provide signs and seasons, to provide light during the nighttime, and to proclaim the glory of its creator, which it does very well. Now, what we have here is obviously a picture of a solar eclipse. This is when the moon, from our perspective on Earth, moves in between us and the sun, and it blocks out the sun's light and causes, as I said, a solar eclipse. Now, this is interesting for several reasons. First of all, you'll notice that the moon perfectly blocks out the sun. And that has a couple of different effects for us. First of all, it creates a spectacular event.
Oh, yes.
Every time one occurs, people travel from all over the world to see these. There's actually travel companies who specialize in taking you to the spots where these occur. Even if it's in the middle of the ocean, you'll go on a cruise ship or whatever. So it's a spectacular view, first of all. Second of all, it allows us scientifically to learn things about the sun that we normally couldn't, because the corona, which is the white area that you see here, is normally invisible to us because the sun's light is so blinding otherwise and we can't see it. When the moon comes and blocks it out, we can.